People credit Adam Smith with inventing modern economics. They call him the father of capitalism. They teach his 1776 work, The Wealth of Nations, as the origin point of economic science. Adam Smith was a popularizer. The original architect was a North African named Ibn Khaldun, and he finished his masterwork 399 years before Smith published a single page. This is not about credit or historical trivia. This is about structural gatekeeping in academic institutions. This is about how the flow of ideas gets bottlenecked through European universities, how intellectual extraction works across centuries, and how the machinery of Western education engineered a narrative where economic thought begins in Scotland in 1776. Ibn Khaldun wrote explicit formulas for supply and demand. He documented the labor theory of value. He mapped the exact pattern by which taxation destroys empires. He explained why every dynasty follows the same 120-year cycle toward collapse. He did all of this from Tunis in 1377. Welcome to Noob Historian. We follow the money, trace the power, and expose the history they never taught you in school. The tax system you live under right now operates according to principles Ibn Khaldun identified 6 centuries ago. When politicians debate whether cutting taxes increases revenue, they are repeating his analysis word for word. When economists warn about institutional decay, they echo his civilizational framework. When empires rise and collapse, they follow his predicted pattern with disturbing precision. You learned Adam Smith in school because someone decided you should not learn Ibn Khaldun. The gatekeepers of Western academia chose to bury the contributions of a North African Muslim and relocate the origins of economic thought to 18th century Europe. Today, you find out what they buried and why. Ibn Khaldun did not guess at economic principles. He observed them across 4 decades of direct political experience in kingdoms stretching from Spain to Egypt. He tested his theories against the rise and fall of dynasties he witnessed firsthand. He produced a system of economic analysis so sophisticated, so precise, and so predictive, it remains accurate 650 years later. Modern economists have a term for the tax phenomenon he described. They call it the Laffer Curve. Arthur Laffer himself has admitted the concept originated with Ibn Khaldun. Ronald Reagan quoted Ibn Khaldun directly from the White House in 1981. The principle shaped the largest tax policy shifts of the late 20th century. Yet Ibn Khaldun does not appear in your economics textbook. His name was not mentioned in your high school history class. Your university professors skipped past him to begin economic history with European thinkers. This erasure was not accidental. It was engineered. And the machinery of this intellectual colonialism continues operating today. Ibn Khaldun entered the world on May 27, 1332, in Tunis. His family carried the bloodline of Yemeni Arabs who had migrated to Spain during the early Islamic expansion. For generations, the Khaldun family had served as advisors, generals, and ministers to the rulers of Andalusian Spain. When the Christian reconquest pushed Islamic rule southward, the family relocated to North Africa, bringing centuries of administrative experience with them. This was not an ordinary lineage. The Khalduns understood how governments functioned from the inside. They knew the levers of taxation, military funding, trade policy, and bureaucratic management. Young Abd al-Rahman ibn Khaldun absorbed this knowledge before he ever opened a book. His formal education followed the traditional Islamic curriculum. He memorized the Quran. He studied Arabic linguistics, Islamic jurisprudence, and Aristotelian philosophy. He trained under the leading scholars of the Maghreb. By age 20, he had completed an education equivalent to multiple graduate degrees in the modern system. Then the Black Death arrived in 1348 and killed both his parents. This personal catastrophe forced Ibn Khaldun into the world of politics far earlier than he intended. Orphaned and ambitious, he took positions in the courts of North African sultans. Over the next 3 decades, he accumulated direct experience across more kingdoms and political systems than any scholar of his era. He served the Hafsid rulers of Tunis. He advised the Marinid sultans of Fez in Morocco. He worked at the Nasrid court in Granada, the last Islamic kingdom in Spain. He negotiated treaties with Pedro the Cruel of Castile. He was imprisoned. He was exiled. He witnessed coups, assassinations, betrayals, and the complete collapse of political order multiple times. Each experience added data to his growing mental model. He observed how new dynasties kept taxes low and stimulated economic growth. He watched mature dynasties raise taxes until merchants fled and production collapsed. He tracked how tribal solidarity eroded after rulers settled into urban luxury. He saw the same patterns repeat across different cultures, religions, and geographies. By 1375, Ibn Khaldun had grown exhausted by political intrigue. He needed time to think. He retreated to a fortress called Qalat ibn Salama in what is now Algeria. There, protected by thick walls and isolation, he began writing. 4 years later, he emerged with the Muqaddimah. This was not a book produced by abstract contemplation. This was the distilled experience of a man who had watched economies collapse, witnessed governments fail, and observed the mechanics of human society across multiple civilizations. Every principle he documented, he had seen in action. The scholars of medieval Europe produced philosophy based on ancient texts and theological reasoning. Ibn Khaldun produced social science based on direct observation and cross-cultural comparison. He was operating 4 centuries ahead of his time. The Muqaddimah was intended as an introduction to a larger historical work called Kitab al-Ibar, the Book of Lessons. The introduction outgrew its purpose. It became the most sophisticated analysis of human society produced before the modern era. Franz Rosenthal's 1958 translation for Princeton University Press runs to 3 volumes and contains over 4,000 scholarly footnotes documenting Ibn Khaldun's sources and methodology. The work addresses geography, climate, economics, taxation, currency, trade, labor, agriculture, urban development, tribal solidarity, political succession, and civilizational decline. Ibn Khaldun rejected the approach of previous historians. They recorded events. He wanted to explain causes. He wrote in his opening pages, "The inner meaning of history involves speculation and an attempt to get at the truth, subtle explanations of the causes and origins of existing things, and deep knowledge of the how and why of events." This was empirical method, stated explicitly 250 years before Francis Bacon and 300 years before the European scientific revolution. The economic sections of the Muqaddimah contain formulations so precise they read like modern textbooks. Ibn Khaldun stated the law of supply and demand in clear terms. When goods are scarce and rare, their prices rise. When there is abundance, prices fall. This observation might seem obvious today. In 1377, no European had written it down. The principle would not appear in Western economic literature for another 400 years. Ibn Khaldun went further. He analyzed why prices differed between cities. He explained how population size affected the cost of goods. He documented the relationship between transportation costs and local prices. He mapped the infrastructure of medieval trade routes and identified the pressure points where merchants extracted profit. He wrote about labor with equal precision. His labor theory of value stated, "Profit is the value realized from labor. Workers produce value through effort. That value becomes profit when sold." Karl Marx would build his entire economic system on this principle 500 years later, apparently unaware of his North African predecessor. Ibn Khaldun analyzed the division of labor and craft production. He observed how specialized workers in large cities produced higher quality goods than generalists in small towns. He explained how urban concentration created economic efficiency. Adam Smith would make identical observations in 1776 and receive full credit for the insight. The Muqaddimah also contains a sophisticated analysis of currency and monetary policy. Ibn Khaldun understood how debasing currency destroyed purchasing power. He tracked the relationship between gold and silver ratios. He documented how governments manipulated money supply to fund military campaigns, and how these manipulations crashed commercial activity. Every major principle of classical economics appears in this 14th century North African text. Supply and demand, labor value, division of labor, monetary theory, taxation effects, trade dynamics, urban economics. The book existed, scholars copied it. It circulated through Islamic universities from Morocco to Central Asia. European colonizers eventually acquired manuscripts and deposited them in libraries from Madrid to Paris. Yet Western economic education begins with Adam Smith in 1776, as if nothing came before. Ibn Khaldun's most famous economic contribution concerns taxation. His analysis of how tax policy affects revenue became the foundation of modern supply-side economics, though his name rarely appears in the footnotes. He wrote in the Muqaddimah, "It should be known at the beginning of the dynasty, taxation yields a large revenue from small assessments. At the end of the dynasty, taxation yields a small revenue from large assessments." This single observation contains the complete theory. New dynasties keep taxes low. Low taxes allow merchants and craftsmen to prosper. Prosperity generates economic activity. Economic activity produces taxable transactions. The government collects large revenue from a thriving economy despite modest tax rates. As dynasties age, Ibn Khaldun continued, rulers develop expensive habits. They build palaces, they expand armies, they fund elaborate court ceremonies. These expenses require more revenue. The government raises tax rates. Higher rates produce initial revenue increases. But the increases are temporary. Merchants begin hiding income. Craftsmen reduce production because the profit margin no longer justifies the effort. Some producers relocate to regions with lower taxes. Economic activity contracts. The dynasty responds by raising rates again. The contraction accelerates. Eventually, the government collects less total revenue at high rates than it previously collected at low rates. The dynasty has destroyed its own tax base. Ibn Khaldun wrote, "A tax on people's property removed the incentive to acquire and gain property. When the incentive to acquire and obtain property is gone, people no longer make efforts to acquire any." This is not vague philosophy. This is a precise description of how tax incentives shape economic behavior. The principle applies to any era, any economy, any political system. In 1974, economist Arthur Laffer sketched a curve on a napkin during a meeting with Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. The curve illustrated how both 0% and 100% tax rates produce zero revenue. Somewhere in between exists an optimal rate producing maximum revenue. This sketch became the intellectual foundation of Reaganomics. Arthur Laffer has acknowledged his debt to Ibn Khaldun in multiple interviews. He told the Wall Street Journal in 1978 about the historical precedent. The Laffer Curve should properly be called the Khaldun Curve. Ronald Reagan took the attribution further. On February 5, 1981, President Reagan addressed the nation on economic policy. He stated directly, "Ibn Khaldun, the 14th century Muslim philosopher of history, said it all. He said in the beginning of the empire, the weights were very light and yet yielded large revenues. At the end of the empire, the weights were very heavy and yielded small revenues." This quote appears in the official White House archives. The President of the United States credited a 14th century Tunisian scholar on national television as the source of his tax policy. Yet economics textbooks continue describing the Laffer Curve without mentioning Ibn Khaldun. Students learn about Reagan's supply-side revolution without learning its 600-year-old origins. The political application gets European and American branding, while the intellectual foundation remains buried. This is not oversight. This is systematic erasure of non-Western contributions to economic thought. The machinery of academic gatekeeping operates with remarkable efficiency. Ibn Khaldun's economic theories connect to a larger framework explaining why civilizations rise and fall. He called the driving force Asabiyyah. The term translates roughly as group solidarity or social cohesion. Asabiyyah is the bond uniting members of a tribe, a nation, or a political movement. It creates willingness to sacrifice personal interest for collective survival. It generates the cooperation necessary to build and maintain complex institutions. Ibn Khaldun observed across his political career how Asabiyyah determined political outcomes. Tribal groups with strong solidarity conquered urban civilizations with weak solidarity. New dynasties founded by these conquering groups eventually lost their Asabiyyah through generations of urban living and luxury. He wrote, "Royal authority is the goal of group feeling. When a dynasty achieves this goal, the group feeling begins to relax." The pattern repeated across every civilization Ibn Khaldun studied. Desert tribes with intense solidarity invaded settled kingdoms. They established new dynasties. The first generation of rulers remembered hardship and maintained discipline. The second generation grew up in palaces and knew hardship only through stories. The third generation assumed luxury was the natural order. By the fourth generation, the ruling class had forgotten how to fight, how to sacrifice, and how to cooperate under pressure. They hired mercenaries instead of leading armies. They raised taxes instead of inspiring loyalty. They built walls instead of maintaining alliances. These weakened dynasties became targets for new groups with strong Asabiyyah. The cycle repeated. Ibn Khaldun estimated the average dynasty lasted 120 years, roughly 4 generations. He based this number on empirical observation of dynasties across the Islamic world and Mediterranean region. This framework has implications far beyond medieval politics. Modern scholars have applied Ibn Khaldun's cycle to the rise and fall of corporations, political parties, social movements, and nation-states. The pattern of founding energy, institutional growth, bureaucratic sclerosis, and collapse appears wherever humans build complex organizations. The economic dimension connects directly to taxation theory. Dynasties with strong Asabiyyah keep taxes low because rulers identify with their subjects. They view the economy as a shared project. High taxes would hurt people they consider family. As Asabiyyah weakens, rulers increasingly see subjects as resources for extraction. They raise taxes to fund their own consumption rather than collective goods. The population responds by withdrawing cooperation. Economic production declines. The dynasty accelerates its own collapse. Ibn Khaldun identified the feedback loop between social cohesion and economic policy. Strong solidarity produces good economic policy, which produces prosperity, which should strengthen solidarity. But prosperity also produces urban luxury, which weakens solidarity, which produces bad economic policy, which destroys prosperity. This is systems thinking. This is feedback analysis. This is the foundation of modern complexity economics. And Ibn Khaldun articulated it 650 years ago in a fortress in Algeria. Today, political scientists apply his framework to the European Union, to American political polarization, to Chinese economic planning. The Chinese Academy of Social Sciences has produced studies comparing Ibn Khaldun's 120-year dynastic cycle to concerns about the sustainability of China's development model. His ideas circulate through modern academia under different labels: institutional sclerosis, state capacity, social capital, elite extraction. The vocabulary changes, but the framework remains his. Ibn Khaldun died in Cairo on March 17, 1406. He had spent his final decades teaching at Al-Azhar University, the oldest continuously operating university in the world. He had served as chief judge of the Maliki School of Islamic Law. He had met with Tamerlane, the great conqueror, and discussed the principles of civilizational economics. His reputation in the Islamic world remained substantial for centuries. Scholars copied the Muqaddimah across North Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia. Ottoman intellectuals studied his work. Persian translators made his ideas accessible in Iran. The manuscript tradition preserved his contributions within Islamic civilization. European encounter with this tradition began during the colonial period. French scholars acquired manuscripts from North African collections during the 19th century conquest of Algeria. The Bibliothèque Nationale de France houses 14th and 15th century copies obtained during this period. The Library of El Escorial in Madrid contains earlier copies brought from Islamic Spain. European Orientalists translated portions of the Muqaddimah in the 19th century. They recognized its sophistication. Baron de Slane produced a French translation between 1862 and 1868. Academic journals published analyses of Ibn Khaldun's historical method. But something strange happened as economics professionalized into an academic discipline. David Ricardo, Thomas Malthus, and John Stuart Mill became the classical tradition. Economic thought acquired an origin story beginning in 18th century Britain. Ibn Khaldun did not fit this story. He was North African. He was Muslim. He wrote in Arabic. He predated the European sequence by 4 centuries. Including him would require acknowledging intellectual achievement outside the European tradition. The gatekeepers made their choice. They excluded him. This was not a single decision by a single institution. It was a distributed pattern of choices across dozens of universities, hundreds of textbook authors, and thousands of course syllabi. Each actor made local decisions about what to include and exclude. The aggregate result was systematic erasure. By the mid-20th century, economic students in Western universities learned nothing about pre-Smithian economic thought. The discipline presented itself as beginning with the Enlightenment, emerging from European intellectual culture, and developing through European and American contributions. Jean-David C. Boulakia broke this silence in 1971 with his article, Ibn Khaldun, a 14th century economist, in the Journal of Political Economy. The article documented systematic parallels between Ibn Khaldun's economic theories and modern economic principles. It appeared in one of the most prestigious economics journals in the world. The profession acknowledged the article. Then it continued teaching the same curriculum. Joseph Spengler at Duke University published comparative analysis in 1964 showing Ibn Khaldun his influence on later Islamic and European thought. He documented transmission pathways by which Khaldunian ideas might have reached European thinkers. The profession noted his work. The textbooks remained unchanged. This pattern continued for decades. Individual scholars published rigorous research documenting Ibn Khaldun's contributions. Peer-reviewed journals accepted their work. Academic conferences discussed the evidence. The machinery of academic gatekeeping does not require conspiracy. It requires inertia. Textbook authors copy previous textbooks. Course designers follow departmental templates. Hiring committees evaluate candidates based on standard training. Each generation reproduces the framework they inherited. Changing the framework requires active effort against institutional resistance. Most scholars choose easier paths. The movement to correct this historical distortion has accelerated in the 2020s. Academic institutions have begun acknowledging the Eurocentric framing of their curricula. Oxford University launched its Decolonizing Economics initiative in 2021. The program explicitly addresses Ibn Khaldun. Harvard's economics department conducted a curriculum review acknowledging the problem. The department recognized how standard presentations of economic thought's history exclude non-Western contributions. UNESCO has designated 2032 for recognition of Ibn Khaldun's 700th birth anniversary. The organization is preparing educational materials and academic conferences to increase global awareness of his contributions. These institutional responses indicate shifting norms within academia. The gatekeepers who maintained the old curriculum are retiring. Younger scholars trained in more diverse intellectual environments are assuming positions of influence. The default narrative persists even as alternatives gain ground. Your own economic education has implications you should consider. Every time you hear a politician argue about tax policy, you are hearing an argument Ibn Khaldun settled 650 years ago. The debate between higher rates and broader bases traces directly to his analysis. Supply-side economics and its critics both operate within the framework he established. Every time you watch a great power rise and fall, you are watching the Asabiyyah cycle he documented. The solidarity of founding generations, the decay of institutional purpose, the extraction by entrenched elites, the vulnerability to hungrier competitors. His framework predicts the pattern with disturbing accuracy. Every time you observe a corporation lose its innovative edge, a political party drift from its base, or a social movement fragment into factions, you're observing Khaldunian dynamics. The principles apply across scales and contexts. Ibn Khaldun provided the structural analysis for understanding how human organizations work. He identified the incentives shaping economic behavior. He mapped the life cycle of institutions. He explained why extraction replaces cooperation as organizations age. This knowledge was available in 1377. It circulated through Islamic universities for centuries. It reached European libraries during the colonial period. It has been documented in peer-reviewed Western journals since the 1960s. Ronald Reagan quoted it from the White House in 1981, and your economics teacher never mentioned his name. The question you must answer is what you do with this knowledge now. You learned the distorted history, you absorbed the Eurocentric framework, now you know the fuller history. You know the contributions systematically excluded from your education. You know the machinery of intellectual colonialism continues operating in academic institutions worldwide. You have three options. You file this information as interesting historical trivia and continue operating with the mental models you already possess. This is the easiest path. Most viewers will choose it. Second, you educate yourself further. You read the Muqaddimah. Franz Rosenthal's translation is available through Princeton University Press and the Internet Archive. You study the academic literature comparing Khaldunian and Western economic thought. You develop your own assessment of his contributions. Third, you participate in changing the institutional frameworks. You ask your local university why their economics curriculum excludes Ibn Khaldun. You request your library acquire his works. You mention him when discussions of economic history arise. You become part of the correction rather than a passive recipient of the distorted narrative. The choice reflects your understanding of how knowledge systems work. Information flows through institutions. Institutions are maintained by human choices. The gatekeepers who excluded Ibn Khaldun made choices. The gatekeepers who include him will also make choices. Enough individual choices aggregate into institutional change. Ibn Khaldun understood this dynamic. He wrote about how ideas spread through social networks, how prestige shapes intellectual adoption, and how institutional positions determine whose voices get heard. He would recognize exactly what happened to his own legacy. The North African genius who invented economic cycles also predicted why his own contributions would be buried. His framework explains the behavior of the institutions that excluded him. The colonial powers who dominated global education had weak incentive to credit an Arab Muslim predecessor. Their Asabiyyah was European. Their intellectual genealogy began with Greeks and continued through Europeans. Ibn Khaldun would not be surprised by his own erasure. He would view it as one more data point confirming his theory of how civilizations construct their self-narratives. The correction now underway would also not surprise him. As European civilizational confidence weakens, as non-Western powers rise, as the global distribution of intellectual production shifts, the narratives will shift with them, the gatekeepers will change, the curriculum will adapt, new students will learn different stories. This is the Asabiyyah cycle applied to academic institutions. The old order decays, new energy arrives from outside the established centers. The framework persists even as its champions change. You live at the inflection point. The old curriculum still dominates most classrooms. The correction has begun but remains incomplete. Your own knowledge positions you between the dying narrative and its replacement. What you do with this positioning is your choice. Ibn Khaldun wrote his masterwork alone in a fortress 650 years ago. The ideas survived because people copied them, taught them, and transmitted them across generations. The distortion occurred because different people chose to exclude them from their own transmission chains. You are now a node in this transmission network. The ideas reached you today through this video. They will reach others through you, or they will stop here. The North African genius who predicted every empire's fall also predicted the dynamics of his own intellectual legacy. He understood the flow of ideas through human networks. He mapped the incentives, shaping what gets transmitted and what gets forgotten. The people who receive knowledge bear responsibility for what happens next. The structures of the future emerge from the choices of the present. Ibn Khaldun gave you the framework for understanding your own world. The tax debates, the imperial cycles, the institutional decay, the rise of new powers. His 14th century analysis applies directly to your 21st century reality. The question is whether you will use it.